Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar. I am the host and I am the thrilled interviewer today of Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, who has written a marvelous book. You've probably seen it, Heart of a Stranger. It's a memoir. It's brand new on the New York Times bestseller list, debuting at number 9. That's new news. You heard it here first. And we are here to talk about this wonderful book. I'm going to just give you a little bit of an introduction and then jump right in with Angela, Rabbi Buchdahl. And this has been a terrific opportunity for us because for the Blazers, I hope you appreciate this. The rabbi is on a national book tour and she has chosen to squeeze us in, and that's just terrific. So Almighty Blaze, for those of you who are new to it, welcome, welcome. We are a group of about 30 creative professionals who have been volunteering our time since the onset of COVID. Jenna Blum and Carolyn Levitt saw the need for authors who had slaved over their books and suddenly found their book tours canceled. We found a need to connect our readers to our authors and to make sure that people were still out there buying books, because the indie booksellers did a great job of making sure they were shipping books to people during COVID. We are now 5+ years in. We are going strong, and we have no intention of going anywhere else. We are all over social media. Our Twitter account, we don't call it X yet. Our Twitter account is having a little bit of a glitch, but if you search for us, you'll find us. We look like, it seems like we were shut down for reasons we don't quite know, but we are all over everywhere else: TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can find all sorts of information about our shows on our website, www.amightyblaze.com. And while you're there, you should sign up for our newsletter, and you will get an email every other week telling you about all of our shows and how to access our archive, which has virtually all of our shows going back 5 years. It's a really great resource for people who love books. And if you are a returning Blazer, thank you so much. You know how much we appreciate your support. As always, we don't ask for any money here at the Blaze. We just ask that you keep going to indie bookstores and buying books, especially the books of the authors we feature. And you can find Angela's book on bookshop.org in our shelf. Okay, and when you buy it from there, it actually sends a few pennies our way, and that can help us keep the lights on. So thank you for that. Let me just give you a very brief introduction to Angela. I usually start reading all sorts of blurbs and praise from reviews. There are too many to cull, so I'm going to skip all that and get straight to the bio and then into the questions. And if you have some, please put them in the comments. We may get to them at the end. I can't promise, but we're going to try. So Angela Buchdahl is the first Asian American rabbi. She serves as the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue of New York. She's the first woman to lead this flagship congregation in its 185-year history. Under her leadership, the congregation has grown to be one of the largest synagogues in the world, with live stream viewers in more than 100 countries. I know plenty of people who tune in, whether it's high holiday services or Friday night services, or follow you on all of your social media to catch up. So it's great. Rabbi Buchdahl has led prayers in the White House for 2 U.S. presidents and is frequently featured on national news programs when there are interesting topics affecting the Jewish world, morality, you name it. She's there. She's on call. She lives in New York City with her husband, and they have 3 children. And I am just delighted to welcome you.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here with so many book lovers and book supporters.
Yes. And we are happy that you have carved out a little space on your book tour, which, as I understand, you are having sellout audiences. So the Blazers should be very proud to see you here.
Thank you. It's been so wonderful to actually meet what feels like my extended community all around. And I'm actually not so far from you right now. I'm in Florida.
Which is nice. Enjoying the weather, I hope.
Yes.
So Angela's story, for those of you who may not have seen, is a fabulous story. It's a story of immigration. It's a story of a feminist, a woman achieving a very high position in U.S. society. it's the story of so many things. It's universal. It's not a Jewish book per se, but it is a Jewish book in many ways. Can you just give our viewers a sense of what your background is and why this book might fascinate people who are either involved in Judaism or not?
Yeah. I mean, I do, on the one hand, I feel like my story is so particular and unlike anyone else's, but I've also found that the response to this book, but also times when I talk about my particular specific story, is when you talk about the truth of our human experiences, and in particular, the experience of sometimes feeling like you're the outsider or the stranger and you're longing for belonging and home and finding your way, that is a deeply held experience that all people have. And, I grew up, as all of you, I'm going to guess, a huge book lover, and books were basically revered in my household, from my Korean grandmother who owned a bookstore in her little village in Korea, to my father who read to me every night. It was the dad who read to me at bed, not my mom. And growing up in my public library as a kid and just spending hours in the public library every week, I didn't think I could write a book. I also never saw my own story reflected in a book. But in this interesting way, as a young immigrant Korean Jew, I actually saw my story in the truth of the larger biblical story and the narrative that I learned as a young Jewish child. And the first one, the one that kind of orients this book, is this one of Abraham and Sarah, who are called to leave their birthplace and their homeland and to go to a place they do not know, and so they can be a blessing. And that act of leaving their home and leaving everything that's familiar behind in order to follow a calling is the story of the Jewish people. When they cross over, that word in Hebrew is literally where the word Hebrew comes from. To be a Hebrew is a boundary crosser. That's the literal translation of Hebrew. So I realized that I heard that story and I thought, that's my story. I had to leave my birthplace and cross over to this place where I felt like I was a hyphenated American. I didn't feel like I fully fit in. I had this Korean face and I didn't fit in the Jewish community, but I wasn't fully Korean either as a biracial child. And so I didn't know where I fit in. And yet all along the way, I found ways that I found my truest sense of home and belonging. And I think that every one of us has moments where we feel called to leave whatever is most familiar and comfortable behind, because we feel called for some reason. And sometimes those are geographic leavings, like you have to leave one place for another, but sometimes it's leaving your family's expectations for what you're going to do, or societal, like gender expectations or norms. And we're breaking different boundaries and ending up in places that feel uncertain for those reasons. And the end of the biblical story says you will be a blessing. So that is this book is an invitation for each of us to follow that spiritual imperative, to be a boundary crosser, so that we can actually fulfill our purpose here and also find our truest home. So that's the overall big message of the book that I actually think is universal. And I was so thrilled that my editor is actually not a Jewish editor. She's a legendary editor who's been in this business for decades, and she has her own imprint at Viking. And she saw this book as a book that was not just for the Jewish community, but for far beyond it. And I've been really gratified to hear from people that that's the case.
That's beautiful. I forgot to show you this beautiful cover, Heart of the Stranger, photographed by Annie Leibovitz.
Yes, by Annie Leibovitz.
Not too shabby.
Yeah, that was fun. She is a member of my congregation, actually, and she offered to do this as a gift for me, and it was beyond a gift. And she read the entire galley and had sections highlighted so that she could really try to capture what she thought was the essence for this portrait, which is unlike any photograph I've ever taken before. So yes, that was a treat.
It's quite beautiful. So you came to the States when you were a young girl, and you write that you were sort of a spiritual mutt, which I thought was a wonderful phrase. And this idea, the story of Abraham and Sarah, just so happens to be the story that was read in synagogues around the world this past Shabbat.
Yeah.
And it's about being a stranger, Abraham being a stranger, which for people who read the Old Testament is one of the most commonly cited commandments in all of the Old Testament. I think it's 36 times it appears that, you should remember the stranger, for you were a stranger. So did that speak to you when you were a little girl, or it was only later in life that came to be meaningful?
I heard those stories and I'm not sure I fully recognized myself
Mhm.
in them always, but I did know that our tradition really understood that sense of having the heart of a stranger was deeply integral to knowing what it felt like to be a Jew. And of course, it's the story of Abraham and Sarah. It's also the story of 400 years of being slaves in Egypt. And it is, of course, also the story of 2,000 years of diaspora existence. So Jews have lived in multiple countries around the world, places where we have felt more or less at home at different times, but never felt like it was sometimes fully our place. And so we even have felt like strangers for the last 2,000 years of our history. I would even argue that there are ways that Jews, even today in this moment, feel a little bit like not as comfortable in America as maybe we thought we were. So here's this experience. And as a kid growing up, I often felt sort of almost apologetic for feeling like I was the outsider, that I was like a lot of inadequacy of I'm not enough. I don't know enough. I can't, I don't know enough Hebrew. I can't play Jewish geography because I'm from Tacoma, and all these ways that I felt deficient and like an outsider and somewhat marginalized. It took me a while to understand that actually was a source of my empathy and maybe creativity and maybe my grit and resilience. It took me a while to understand that is also I think the Jewish source of so much of Jewish character, our of our command for empathy and the ways that we have adapted when the door's been shut on us. We found a different way to do something. So instead of seeing this as our burden, which, listen, it's not usually very comfortable. I wouldn't say that we seek it out, but it is also has been the source of our growth and our strength. And I would invite us to think about that. And I would offer that this is not just the Jewish experience, not just because the Bible is a shared text for all the religions that are Abrahamic religions, which
Mhm.
include Christianity and Islam, but also because I actually think it's a deeply human experience. And we're living in a time in America where, as an Asian American, I think Asian Americans, especially post, pandemic, have felt more outsider and more hate, unfortunately, than
Otherized.
felt in a long time. The rise of anti-Asian hate, and I think also, we really understand we're still in a racial reckoning. That it didn't solve everything to have an African American president. There's still a lot of racism that is still prevalent in our society. And you could go through every minority group. They feel like in some way they're not as much at home as they want to be. And I guess maybe the shocking thing is understanding, especially I think with these last elections we've had, the hearing from white Christian men in America who feel that they feel also that they're somewhat strangers in this country. I think for different reasons, we are feeling this right now. So this could be something that you could dismiss that feeling from people, which I don't recommend, or we could say, if everyone is feeling this way, maybe this is our initial point of connection instead of being the way that we build more walls against each other. And I think that it is actually deeply humanizing to understand you too feel like you've been the stranger. So let's talk about that. And actually, let's not just talk about it. Let's create a sense of belonging and home. Let's create the society we want where all of us can feel like we belong.
Right. So the timing of this book, I think, is just there's so many of the issues that you are addressing in this book that are very, very contemporary, even as this book has within it a lot of ancient learning and philosophy and uh, elements of the Jewish faith and rabbinic tradition. One of the things that you've chosen to do uh, was to end every single chapter with what in Hebrew we call a dvar, a mini sermon, as it were, about a aspect of Judaism that may or may not be familiar to many of the Jewish faith, and may or may not be familiar to non-Jewish readers, but are nonetheless hugely universal. Are there any of those? Was that a tough decision? Did you get any pushback on doing that, or did they say, "Oh, she's a rabbi, we're going to let her do
Well,
whatever she
the
wants"?
backstory on that is obviously the language I'm most comfortable doing is sort of somewhat sermonic, right? I'm used writing sermons. I'm actually less comfortable writing memoir. And in fact, originally the book I wanted to write was not a memoir, but a book of Jewish spiritual teachings. Imagine if you just took all the spiritual teachings, I was going to do a book just like that. I actually think that the book wouldn't have been as strong as it is with memoir, because what I realized from my teacher is, Rabbi David Ellenson, my teacher, said, all theology is autobiographical. So for me to teach the Jewish sermonic pieces, in some ways they're deepened and explicated when you understand the lived experience I've had. And my guess is that every one of us, whether or not you believe in God or another religion or no God at all, the way you see the world, whether or not you think people are fundamentally good, whether or not you feel like you have agency in the world, all these big theological questions, they're all informed by our personal experiences. And so I realized that I needed to put the story pieces in before I taught the sermonic pieces. Not only that, but my agent, who was a brilliant agent, was like, I don't think that the Jewish spiritual teachings book is going to sell to the mainstream press, but if you write it as a memoir, slip in the Jewish teachings, that I think we can sell. And so she was very wise, and I actually think it's a better book for it. So I'll share one example. So I have this story about teaching the Jewish concept of humility, which is called anava in Hebrew. And you often think, or I grew up thinking, that humility is about almost like lowering yourself or almost debasement, like, oh, I'm going to be so humble. And actually the Jewish spiritual practice called Musar, a teacher, Rabbi Alan Marinus, gives his beautiful definition of anava, of humility. And he says, it is taking up your appropriate space.
Now, I wrote that quote down. No more than my space, no less than my place.
Yes, that second part is important. No more than my space, but no less than my place. Meaning sometimes when we demur and say, no, it couldn't possibly be me, or I don't want to step forward. Sometimes that is not true humility. That can be its own narcissism, because you're still making the moment about you as opposed to what is required for the moment. And I will give you the example I shared was a story, which was when I became the rabbi at Central Synagogue. Within the first few months of my becoming the rabbi of this large synagogue, and I was the first woman, and of course I'm the first Asian American rabbi, as you heard. Well, I had this huge honor of being invited to lead the blessings for President Obama at the White House Hanukkah party. And you might be surprised to know that when I was first given the invitation, I declined it. Wow. And I said to my husband, I said, I was invited for this honor, but you know what? I know I'm only being asked because I'm like a female Asian rabbi. So I said no. And my husband said, are you kidding me? He said, that's exactly why you have to go. He said, do you understand what a statement it is that you are a woman leading these rabbis and an Asian, and you're doing this at the White House? So I realized that kind of humility is not actually helpful in moments like this. And I think that especially for female leaders, and I'm someone who, had the honor of, I guess, breaking a stained glass ceiling, as they say, in our tradition, because it was very rare, and it still is rare, for female rabbis to lead very large congregations, that oftentimes taking up no more than your space, but no less than your place, often means that we have to almost be uncomfortably making ourselves sit at the table, because in the past, we weren't invited to those tables. So taking up your appropriate space sometimes means being more assertive than we are always comfortable doing, as especially as female leaders. And so I do think that that's an example of a Jewish teaching that I think is deeply universal for all of us. It's my goal was to bring the wisdom of a 3,000-year-old tradition in an accessible way for all people to be able to understand and gain from.
Yes, I think you do that beautifully. And I think there was just such a great marriage of the storytelling, your narrative and your personal narrative growth, life journey, with these individual sections about different aspects of Judaism, all of which, again, I think were hugely accessible. The one, and this sort of piggybacks on what you were saying, one of the ones that I am always been fascinated with is this idea of tzimtzum, which in the beginning in Genesis, God pulled himself back to make space for the world. And this idea of tzimtzum can also apply to individual people. You talk a lot about women in particular who sort of make themselves small and shrink a little bit so as not, because if they choose not to and they are ambitious and they are successful, it can make other people a little uncomfortable. And you talked about that a bit when you were both applying to Central to begin with, and then when the senior rabbi position came open, sort of this struggle between leaning in and this humility versus ambition. What advice do you have for women who are trying to balance that? How did you navigate that?
As a child who was Korean, I never saw myself represented in the Jewish community, not in the community, not on the pulpit, but not even in any single Jewish book or anything. And so I realized how much representation matters. It also really matters when we think about positions, and this is not about your identity. This can just be about imagining what the job looks like. So part of my initial response when someone suggested, would you ever want to be the senior rabbi of Central? At the time, I was the senior cantor at the time, which one way you might think about it is that like I was in a number 2 position to my senior rabbi. He certainly gave me a huge amount of responsibility and honor and opportunities, but he was the senior rabbi. He was kind of both senior rabbi and CEO of this large congregation. And we are much more comfortable being in the number 2 position as women, I think. And that is a model, like the kind of the helpmate of the person who's the final word and the face of a community. And it's much harder. And I realized that one of my pieces of advice in some ways is that if you think that you have to inhabit the exact same job and do it exactly the same way as the person who is in that position, then you will definitely talk yourself out of that job, is my guess, because you'll say, but I can't do it like him. And my answer is, and you shouldn't. You will have to figure out not only how you might do it differently, but how the job itself might change, how the culture around the position might change. So yes, I could never have done the job that my beloved predecessor did before me. He had a full-time supportive spouse who did not have work outside of the home. He had grown children who were already out of the house. He had 23 years of being in that community. So I was picturing myself trying to think of how I could possibly do a job where my husband and I would go to dinner every night with congregants the way my predecessor did. And one of the things I had to realize was I'm going to have to make that job look different. And again, and it wasn't just my job looking different, but changing the culture so that it even shifted the culture of paternity leave for the same amount of time for my male colleagues as female colleagues. So starting from the bottom up, that the culture was shifting for the entire clergy team, that male colleagues would also take as much time away with their family as the female colleagues would. So this is the kind of culture shift that you can only do when you're in the decision-making position of being in charge. And so I think that we don't talk enough about the fact that, being in a position of kind of ultimately being responsible for an organization, like the CEO position, senior rabbi position, whatever you want to call that top job, there's a lot of joy in that, first of all, and there's a lot of power to shift the role into a job that actually works for not just women, but also probably differently for our male colleagues as well. So this is, I guess my advice is reimagine. And if you don't see it represented, then you get to be the one who gets to represent it.
Right. You talk about the gift of feeling small is that you can bring something big to the world. And so moving from that sense of I should be shrinking away from these opportunities to I should be stepping into them. And that's a great gift. Can you just talk a little bit? You went from being a cantor who leads prayer, music, liturgy, a lot of traditional, as well as you are doing a lot of music, new music. How was that shift from doing that to being a rabbi who, yes, is also leading prayer, but is also delivering the message, the sermon, the part of the service that changes every week in ways that the music does not?
Mm-hmm. Well, my last answer gives you some sense of why I wanted to apply for the rabbi position, although it took me a while to get to that. It's not like it was an immediate yes. And you can read about that in the book, about just my own internal and external struggles of applying for the number one position, essentially. And I think the other thing is I loved my job as the senior cantor. I would say that music is my native spiritual language. It was the way that I came into the world, and I was singing to God. And I actually think a lot of kids come into the world singing their way through life and feeling connected to the spirit of the universe, whether they call it God or, their magical friend, or they're just kids are in tune with the kind of enchantment and spirit that is all around us. And I found that music was my most immediate way of connecting with other people, my most immediate way of connecting with something bigger than myself, my most immediate way of just connecting with my joy. And so I loved being the senior cantor. And a part of me was like, why would I leave that job? That's the perfect job. and so when I made the transition, because I had a deep desire to sort of shift this bigger conversation of the culture of the entire institution and maybe even the way Jewish life looked, because I had that desire and I knew that I could do that best from the position as senior rabbi, I did, apply for the job. It was not an easy job for me to get. I was named senior rabbi and voted in by the congregation, and it was quite an incredible moment and, the greatest privilege of my professional life. But I would say the transition wasn't so easy, partly because I found it easier to communicate the deep spiritual truth I wanted by music. It took me much longer to do that with words. And I actually had a colleague who said to me at one point, she said, Angela, I feel like you're relying on your musical voice and you haven't found your rabbinic voice. She said that early on. And I felt like a little bit of a sting when she said it, but I actually think it was deeply true. And I probably was reliant on it in a certain way because it was so much easier for me to do that. And I could just, and so it's taken me longer to find my rabbinic voice with words. Now, I do think, though, that words have a tremendous power to create the reality and the narrative of what something is and to make meaning. So I think that it is, and I never stopped singing, by the way. I still sing at services with my incredible colleagues, my cantorial colleagues who make incredibly beautiful music. But this is, I think that they partner. One helps us intellectually understand something. Those words help us move our frameworks. And then the music helps move the emotional tenor of something. So I use both of these spiritual languages, words and music, to try to shape my congregation and express the soul of who we are and who we want to be.
And music, whether it's classical or in Jewish tradition, nigunim, melodies without words, can be hugely spiritual moments. So that huge shift from music with or without words into, giving a sermon every week and maybe some in the middle and some funeral services and some weddings and all that, there's plenty of speaking. So I'm going to shift a little bit to books and book writing. How did you find, you talked about originally wanting to thinking you were going to write a book of sermons. Mm-hmm. How was it to shift from writing a sermon, which whether in a church or a synagogue or a speaker anywhere in a secular world, people start getting antsy after, 10, 12 minutes. How do you go from writing something that's tight and has to be delivered orally to a book length piece of writing? How did you make that shift?
I mean, so this is my first book, as you know, this is debut author. So this is my first book. And honestly, when I started the process, I wasn't sure that I could actually accomplish it. I found it deeply intimidating. I was smart enough to share in this book with a dear friend and author, brilliant writer, and collaborator on this book, Abby Pogrebin. And so, while it was a very personal book that needed to be in my voice. So I wrote all of the, first draft of everything, but I also learned that so much of good writing or any writing is editing. And I had a master editor that was by my side, both kind of keeping me accountable, holding me to some kind of schedule as I was trying to write this book while I was being the senior rabbi of Central, which was not easy to do, which is why it took me, almost 4 years from when I sold the book to get the book done. So it was a long process. It came in fits and starts. Like in the summer, I'd write for a month and concentrate, and then I would go for months and not write a thing. So it was very, very challenging. And yet I think that the narrative part was in some ways the most fun because I'm a storyteller by nature. My mother is a brilliant storyteller. My grandfather was basically a professional storyteller in his little village in town because he was literate and he would read novels and then tell the stories to his village folk who didn't have, TV or movie theaters at the time. So I'm in a long line of storytellers. And so for me, part of the fun of this was to kind of tell our family story, tell my kind of personal story. And in some ways, that language comes more easily to me than the sermonic almost.
So if you're just joining us, we are talking to Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, whose book, A Heart of a Stranger, just made the New York Times bestseller list. And Angela told me off stage that this is the first time a female rabbi has had a book on the bestsellers list.
That's what I believe. I mean,
wow.
I think that the last time, my editor said this, but I also tried to Google it and confirm it. But that the last rabbi's book that was on the New York Times bestseller list was in 1999. That's over 25 years ago, and it was called Kosher Sex. And then there were other rabbis who've had some bestsellers. All of them are male. So I think it is the first female rabbi's book on the New York Times list. And it's been a little while since we've had one. Thank you.
To our audience, if you have questions, I'm hoping to get to some by the end. I obviously have plenty because that's how I roll. So it's interesting that you said the book you went to contract 4 years ago, because so much of the book seems so timely right now. In fact, I was sort of curious, like what inspired you to write this book right now? And in some ways, this will be a big compliment, I think. If people who go to synagogue and the Torah portion always somehow seems slightly relevant to that specific week.
Yes.
And this book clearly is coming out at a time where so many of the topics that you experienced and you write about in your book are very common going on right now. Was that part of your inspiration? Is that just a lucky coincidence in your mind?
No, honestly, no. And I'm not even sure I would call it lucky, but it's interesting because when I sold this book 4.5 years ago, I guess it's almost now 5 years ago, it's 2021, early 2021. The last 6 chapters of this book hadn't even happened to me yet, right? So I had a sample table of contents, and it didn't include a Colleyville chapter, which was a hostage crisis I got involved in. It didn't include an October 7th chapter. It didn't include my, homecoming back to Korea for my mom's 80th birthday. So none of these chapters even existed. And that last bit of the book, last kind of, 20% of the book or so, which is the more, contemporary piece that I hadn't planned on, it is the shifting nature of what it has been, I think, in many ways for sort of the Jewish experience in America in more recent time. And so I think that I didn't expect it. It was in some ways, it became much more modern time. It's also a really interesting thing. Every other part of my memoir, I was writing it from my memory. Some of it from memory of 40 years ago, like trying to remember myself at age 8 because I didn't keep the diaries. But for these chapters, the last 5-6 chapters, I literally, after the Colleyville thing, because I was involved in a hostage crisis, the FBI asked me to write down my experience with as much detail as possible because they wanted all the details. So I wrote like a 6-page, memory of the day. So then it's very different to write a chapter with that much detail in real time, because our memory does a funny thing over time. First of all, of course, you forget things, but even you might even remember them slightly differently, right? And so it's interesting to go into these chapters in real time because I wrote them in real time. So the October 7th chapter was taken from a sermon I gave in real time. So I think it was a very different experience. And so those chapters, I almost had to think differently about their tone because in some ways the tone shifted, and they were, responding to a moment in a different way. So, I wanted this book. I feel like good sermons are both relevant and timeless. And I'm hoping that this book both has a sense of like speaking to this moment, but also having wisdom that is not just of this moment.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things in terms of wisdom of this moment is this idea of taking a technological Shabbat, which was popularized several years ago by people who said, "Oh, gee, you know, traditional Jews and in particular, and some other Jews by choice, turn off their technology entirely. Play board games, read books, spend time with family, go hiking." One day a week, and as Jews, we choose the Sabbath, Friday night to Saturday night. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was a sort of a trend in the secular world of doing that as well. And fairly recently, Charlie Kirk was into that and talked
Mm-hmm.
about going home
Sabbath.
and spending the Sabbath with his family and being with his children. And can you talk about why, for anybody, that works, or why it works for you and your family, and why somebody who is glued to their phone like I am might seek to try it or embrace that?
Yeah. I mean, I think if there is one innovation that Judaism brought to the whole world that would change the entire world, would be all of us taking Sabbath once a week. And what I mean by that, you don't have to keep exactly the laws of traditional Jews of like absolutely everything. But imagine that you are going to prioritize on that day, that you're not actually running errands or producing or creating. You are just taking one day to be, to just be, to be with the people you love, to understand that you are enough, that you don't have to be, climbing the ladder or, doing the fitness or all the things like that. It's not about your deficiencies. It's about enoughness, and it's about wholeness, and it's about family time. My friend Dan Senor wrote a beautiful book about Israel recently, and he said, imagine how we all love Thanksgiving, because you have a day that is like sort of set aside. You feel like the entire world is doing it with you, and you just are with people you love. You have a great meal. You sit around. You talk about big ideas and and spend time with people you love. And imagine now that part of what makes this work is that you have Thanksgiving every week.
Just
He
without the
calls
football
Shabbat
games.
Thanksgiving every week. What's that?
Just without the football games.
Without the football games, exactly. So, and for my family, I would say, I didn't grow up keeping a more traditional Sabbath growing up. I mean, we had Friday night dinner often. It was always Korean food because of my mother, but we marked Shabbat in some way, but we didn't really set the whole day apart. As I raised a family, my family really did keep Shabbat, and we had a community of people we did it with who all were doing it with us. And so we would have these leisurely meals on Saturday afternoon where we would sit around the table until the sun went down, and we would just talk and talk about our lives and talk about big ideas. Our children at some point might become restless, and then they would go off, and because they weren't on their phones, because that was not allowed on the Sabbath, they would do analog things like, you know, play board games or just hang out on the bed and talk to each other, which kids just don't do that anymore without any technology. And I honestly think that it has saved their souls in a sense, and it has actually reinforced the strength of our families and given us a community that feel like our family in a deep way. So yes, I highly encourage it. You do have to make, I actually find that all these rules, it might feel like it's very hard to have rules like don't spend money, don't drive in a car, don't use your phone. I promise you, those rules, those boundaries create incredible freedom. You have to almost believe that you are not allowed to do those things, and then you have the luxuriousness of time.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit, talk about your book tour. I know you're all over the country, and have taken a bit of a sabbatical from Central Synagogue in New York, which is where you live and work. Um, what's been most surprising about your book tours?
It's a great question. I mean, my synagogue is unusual in that it's a large synagogue in New York, but we also live stream out our services, and we have people watching from over 100 countries, and we know that. And we have approximately 1 million viewers that watch us on our high holidays, which are the largest holidays of the year. Even on a typical Shabbat, which is a Friday night service, we will have maybe 50,000 viewers or so. So I think one of the things that's been surprising is that I feel like I'm not meeting strangers in all of these cities. I am meeting my extended Central Synagogue family. And the number of people who come up to me and say, "You're in my living room every week." And I was like, oh, so we know each other, or at least
Yes.
you feel like you know me. And that is an interesting thing, to feel like I'm starting this already from a place of familiarity. And it is, and it does make me feel like we are a kind of one much bigger, larger family. It's also been very moving for me to meet people who are not Jewish at some of these book talks. I was at Cambridge Public Library. I've done a couple of events that are not specifically Jewish venues. And to hear people say, I'm Catholic and I really related to this book, or I understood these Bible stories in a different way, Bible stories that are familiar to me, but hearing them from the Jewish perspective. Or just also, I related to these stories. These are not, I also immigrated to this country, or I am someone who always felt like I was a little bit different than everyone, or I'm a female professional and I recognized your struggle in my own workplace. There are many, many themes in this book that I think resonate for different reasons for different people. So different people, and I've done many interviews now, and they're never the same. People pick very different things from the book that they want to ask me about. And I love that. It keeps it fresh, and for me, but also it means that different parts are resonating in different ways for people.
Yes, I think it does. I know from talking to other writers that I've had on, in particular with writers who have done books of Jewish themes, that they've sort of been surprised and struggled with things like security issues, unwelcome questions from people who have issues with Jewish people in America, or specific Jewish people in America. And at the same time, so I'm wondering if you've experienced any of that. I mean, clearly you are a very visible, prominent face. That's why you got the call from the rabbi in Colleyville when there was a hostage taking, and the perpetrator wanted to speak to you because he had seen your face and knew who you were and thought you had pull in a way that was challenging. Has that security issue? I mean, a lot of people don't know that synagogues, long before Tree of Life, long before October 7th, had a need for some level of security. Has it been different on the book tour? Is it?
No, it's not different. I mean, I think, unfortunately, and you mentioned Charlie Kirk. I mean, what a tragic death. And we should not live in a world where people who might have political differences think that they can resort to violence. I mean, there's just been such unbelievable political violence recently, and it's frightening, and we have to all lower the temperature and decrease the hate and polarization as much as we all can. And I hope to contribute to that softening. But there's no question that as my visibility has grown, I've become more of a target for other unwanted attention,
Yes.
for sure. And so, yes, we have to think about security on this book tour. Security, of course, my synagogue's had security for as long as I've been there, but increasing security at the synagogue, and unfortunately, that is a world we're living in now. And I think we all can contribute to, when we hear violent rhetoric, understanding that can lead to violent actions. So we should all not only be checking that in ourselves, but when we hear others use it, we should actually be willing to speak out and say, that's not the way we should be talking about someone. Because I think that we really do need to change the way we're speaking about people with whom we might disagree.
Yeah, I mean, we're all strangers, as you say, and sometimes it's scary to be a stranger and to show that empathy. And there's obviously, in certain situations, there are risks to one's personal safety by doing so. But to your book's point, the impulse to do the right thing shouldn't be squelched either.
Right. And I don't want to live my life in fear. So I just, you just have to kind of do this balance of being cautious and smart, and take your precautions, and also, stand by your principles and your values.
So I'm going to close this out, I think, with something that I found was really interesting is that there are two places and maybe more in your book where the person giving you advice about the goals in life is your mother. And that and the book describes many of your experiences being with your mother, sharing her Buddhist background with you and how that informs your rabbinate and your life in general. But you talk early in the book in your introduction, you say, I never gave up because my ancestors' spiritual imperative and my parents' example taught me that the goal of life is not to be affirmed, settled, and comfortable. Rather, it's to find a purpose and pursue it. Almost always, this requires leaving what is familiar and secure to wander into what is risky and uncertain. And then you come back a little later when you were thinking about moving from Scarsdale, your earlier synagogue, into New York City and all the kinds of changes that would mean for your family. And you talked to your mother and you were nervous, as we all do, we call mom. And she said, the goal in life is not to be comfortable. The goal of life is to realize your potential.
Yeah, that was a pivotal conversation. I remember that leaving my first adult Jewish home, which was in Scarsdale, which I loved. I loved this community, and they loved me back, and I admired the clergy, and there were so many reasons that I could have just stayed there my whole life. But it's also a funny thing to be in a place that you've been in since you were 19, because I started working there as a kid, really as a kid. And there's a certain way that you it's hard to sometimes see yourself as more than the kid, even 10 years later. And sometimes it's hard for them to see you as
been there, done that.
Yes, exactly. And so there was a part of me that understood I needed to leave. And, but the risk of leaving to go to the big city and also with all the financial things, it felt scary. And taking your kids out of this beautiful suburb with green lawns to go into the concrete jungle. It's not people don't usually make that move of 3 kids and moving into the city. They usually go the opposite direction, out to the suburbs. So I found it so daunting to think about doing it. Plus, I didn't really even admit this, but I hadn't yet worked full time in my life at that point. I was 33 years old, and I had been a student that went right into having 3 children and working not like small part-time, big part-time, but still never full-time. And so to take on this daunting, giant full-time job in a 2,000 family congregation was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? So I remember that I said to my mother, they've made it so great for me here. I know that I could just stay and I'd be so comfortable. And that was when my mother said, the goal is not to be comfortable. The goal is to, fulfill your potential. So where can that happen? And there was a part of me that recognized that I was going to always see myself as the kid in Scarsdale. And I needed to take that leap, even though it felt like it was as good a chance I was going to fail as succeed.
Well, you leaned in, you have succeeded. There is no doubt about that. As people around the world have watched you grow perhaps in your role. And for that, we are also grateful. I am thrilled that we were able to have you come to the Blaze. Blaze Nation is a better place for it. I encourage everybody, go out, buy this book, A Heart of a Stranger. As Jenna often says, go buy 50 copies. And give it to your friends.
I'll take it.
I'm sure the rabbi would enjoy that. It's been a huge personal honor for me, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
All right. And one more thing. I am back tomorrow with more Debut Spotlight. Back-to-back shows, not a frequent happening, but it does happen now and then. I will be speaking to Tamar Shapiro, who has written a debut novel called Restitution, which is about Germans' reunification and the history of East and West Berlin and people moving from one side to the other and what it means for a family to uncover their secrets and try to get their property back. And it's just a very beautiful book. You will learn a lot of history and you'll learn a lot about human nature. And I hope you will join me. That'll be 2 p.m. tomorrow, Eastern, on the Blaze, same place, same time. And I hope to see you then. Till then, keep reading. Thanks again, Angela.
Thank you.